Yeah, I think we have today two destructive possibilities, and that's how we have to avoid and thrive, as you said in your book. The first one is a tariff war that will hinder international commerce. And the second one, perhaps more dangerous yet, is proliferation of nuclear weapons, because countries will feel insecure, say that we cannot be no longer protected by the American nuclear umbrella, so we have to build our own nuclear arsenal. So those are two negative spirals. How do you perceive that we can transform this destructive spiral into a constructive one?
Through a lot of constructive, skillful, intelligent negotiation, where you really try to understand the other side's interests, all the interests involved, and where it's going to take not just the leaders, but behind the scenes, back channel, trusted intermediaries who can work on both sides to try, out of the news light, out of the social media, but working to craft intelligent agreements that address the interests of both parties, or in this case, many different parties, and allow things to move on. You just had, for example, in Germany last week, there was this very tight window where the German political parties had to agree to lift off the debt brake so that Germany could borrow more money, so it could support Ukraine, basically grow as a society and readapt to the modern world. They needed to do that. And, there was a lot of tussle between the different forces in Germany, but they were successful in doing that so that there's a way that Germany now can expand the pie rather than just quarrel about a fixed pie or even a shrinking pie.
Bill, and this is a very important point, and you gave in your example in your book that called me attention. The first one, that you end up appealing to a former basket player, Rodman, in order to try to talk to North Korea. And I think that was a very good example. And the second example that you have illustrated is the question of Camp David, how Camp David was the perfect scenario for understanding between two antagonist power at that time, Egypt and Israel. Please tell us a little bit about those two examples that shows quite well how can you work backstage in order to try to bring a better atmosphere for a deal, for understanding.
For sure, Felipe. In the case of North Korea, this was in the first Trump administration. Kim Jong Un, the dictator of North Korea, was busily building nuclear weapons and testing nuclear missiles that could be aimed at the United States and elsewhere, and threatening. And President Trump said, "That's not going to happen. I'm not going to let that happen," and drew a red line. And then they started insulting each other. You remember Little Rocket Man and Vile Old Goddard, and Trump threatened fire and fury. He was going to eliminate just totally destroy the country of North Korea, and vice versa. And experts were worried that there was a serious chance, maybe the most serious chance since the Cuban Missile Crisis, of a nuclear war, which would be absolutely devastating for the Korean Peninsula, but for the world. Millions and millions of people would die. And for the world economy would go into depression because, you have all the makers of computer chips and semiconductors, Samsung and all of those over there in Seoul. So we began, my colleagues and I, by writing Donald Trump's victory speech and Kim Jong Un's victory speech, because they were going towards war. But is there a victory in which they don't go to war? And, Trump needed to be able to say, look, I made the best deal ever, the deal of the century, the deal of the millennium. I saved, humanity from a nuclear war. I kept America safe, and I didn't spend a penny. If you think about the 3 points of his victory speech, Kim Jong Un, if you looked at it, put yourself in his shoes, he needed to be able to say, I kept my family, my regime, my country safe. Security was number one. Number two was we're finally getting the respect that we deserve from the world because they feel very stigmatized and disrespected. And the third was we have a chance now to become the next Asian tiger. So he had to be able to say something like that. And if you thought about it, but the question was, in order to build the bridge, you need to know something about the other side. And in this case, hardly anyone knew anything about Kim Jong Un. He was new, he was young, no one knew anything. And when I went on the web to find out a little bit about him, the only person I could find who had actually met him and actually become friends with him was a retired American basketball player by the name of Dennis Rodman. Somewhat eccentric, but he was a member of the championship Chicago Bulls in the 1990s. And it turned out that Kim was a secret fan of the Chicago Bulls. And so when Rodman had done an exhibition basketball game in Seoul, in Pyongyang, he had they'd become friends and they'd gone out drinking and whatever. So then I had to track down Dennis Rodman, which wasn't easy. You always look for who do you know, who knows, who's a coach of the Bulls or a coach of the Lakers, or try to figure out. I finally found someone who was willing to introduce me to Dennis Rodman, and I flew out to LA to meet with him. But when I got to the house, he wasn't there. He was out drinking and having a partying and whatever. And then the host said, well, you can wait here in the house and spend the night overnight, and maybe you'll come back in the middle of the night and you can catch him. And so I spent the night, I canceled all my plans, spent the night there. Anyway, the next morning I get up and the housekeeper says, well, yeah, but sometimes he sleeps in for a day or two. And you want me to wake him up? And finally, anyway, she went and woke him up, and he came out about an hour later, and he said, he was not in a very good mood. He said, what do you want? What do you want? Bad day, bad day. And I said, well, I want to talk to you because you're the only one who's ever met Kim Jong Un, and we need to figure out how to avoid a nuclear war. Well, he sat down and he proceeded to tell me about how he had met Kim, how he'd held his baby. And he told me some very important things. He told me, I actually believe that Kim wants peace. He doesn't want war. I said, that's interesting. And what makes you think that? He said, well, one day Kim told me that his dream one day was to walk down Fifth Avenue, New York, with Dennis Rodman, go to Madison Square Garden, and watch the New York Knicks play the Chicago Bulls. And I thought, that gives me a little bit of insight into the dream, that he has a dream of maybe engaging with the West. There's a kind of love-hate relationship with the West. Anyway, long story short, my colleagues and I began to work on a plan and work with the US government, work with the Korean government, work with the North Korean government, whatever, to try and figure out there would be a way. And for Trump, he loved that moment when he shocked the world, and Kim shocked the world when they met together in Singapore. Everyone thought they were going to war, and they met together, and then they started talking about that they were in love with each other, love letters, and so back and forth. So it just was a kind of an illustration to me of how you take seemingly an impossible situation. You go to the balcony, you write the victory speeches, and you try to build that bridge, which might seem unlikely, but it is possible. Now, did they get rid of nuclear weapons in North Korea? No. But what they did was they changed the atmosphere, the psychological, emotional atmosphere, so that the risk of nuclear war, in experts' opinion, went down from as high as 50% to perhaps 1%, what it is today. So that's what you're trying to do, is really try to think creatively, try to go beyond what seems to be possible in a particular situation, and figure out a way that both sides can deliver those victory speeches.